I guess I want to start by saying something you already know. Parenting is really hard. And here's the thing, I think there are things that are happening in our society, things that are ways that we think about our parenting that make it even harder. So much so, I'm not sure if you guys were aware that the Surgeon General put out a report talking about just being a parent places you at risk for mental health challenges. Parents are working harder than they've ever worked before. And our kids are hurting in ways they never have before. We are experiencing an unprecedented mental health crisis in our kids. If we just take a look before COVID, these are statistics before COVID. The rates of depression rose more than 60% among kids 7 to 17. If we look at the decade before COVID, the number of children and teenagers seen in emergency rooms with suicidal thoughts or attempts doubled. And here's the one as an educator that's most alarming to me, and that is the suicide rate for kids is 2 times higher when school is in session. Here's the thing, if you take a look, this graph I saw this and I couldn't unsee it. If we take a look, these are mental health emergency room visits by week in 2019. And if you take a look, the number of visits completely corresponds to the school calendar, doesn't it? If you take a look, that first week ending January 5th, let's see if I can get it here. The first week ending January 5th, it's as low as it gets. And then second semester starts, and look, it drops significantly over the summer. And there it goes right back up again, first semester. And even Thanksgiving, look at the week ending November 30th. Just a couple days off gives a relief to our kids and our families, and then it goes right back up. There's something about our schools that is pushing kids to the edge of their ability to cope, and for some of them beyond that. And in September 2019, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation said that kids in high-achieving schools are now named an at-risk group. This is new to us because we always thought that just attending a high-achieving school will help us protect us from mental health challenges. And now all of a sudden, it's making us more vulnerable. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation named the top environmental conditions harming adolescent wellness. And we knew the first 3, didn't we? Poverty, trauma, discrimination. But all of a sudden, there it is, this excessive pressure to excel. And these kids in high-achieving schools suffer significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, 3 to 7 times the national average. So how did we get here? The things that we're working harder than ever as parents, and our kids are hurting more than ever as parents. We're working harder than ever as schools, and our kids are struggling more than ever in our highest achieving schools. How did we get here? So I want to talk about 4 myths. Myth number 1 is that money makes us happy. And I still believe this, right? I know all the research, and I'm like, no, getting more money, I'll be happier. The thing is, the data doesn't support this. There's like this road to happiness that I think that we all believe that if we just get on this road, we're going to be fine. And I'm not sure if this resonates with you, but to be happy, you've got to have a high income. But to do that, you've got to have a prestigious job. But then, in order to do that, you've got to go to an elite college, right? In order to do that, you got to take extracurricular activities, you got to take a lot of AP classes, and then we've got to excel in the lower grades to be able to have access to those classes, and then we've got to go to an elite preschool to prep us so we can get a head start, and then we have all these early enrichment activities, right? So it's almost like as parents, we've got to build their resume from very, very early ages. I'm so old, but we used to use Baby Einstein. Anyone heard of Baby Einstein? Right? It's like, oh, if they listen to this or they watch this video, then they're going to be so much farther ahead. I was a part of this culture, and then Cherry Preschool, that's the best preschool in Evanston where I'm from, right? We've got to get my kids in there. My kids were not that athletic, so they didn't have to worry about travel teams. But then all of a sudden, it's like, how do we get kids on travel teams? But in order to get on the travel team, don't you need to do all this extra practice? 6 a.m. batting practice and all of these other things? We got to take all these AP classes, but in order to get into college, we got to do some extra tutoring, don't we? We're constantly trying to hack this achievement thing. We're constantly trying to hack this so that we can get there. And some people hacked it a little too much, didn't they? Right? But at some level, we're all in this race together. I can remember when my kids were real young, 6 and 7 and 8, we'd go to dinner parties, not this nice, right? It was never this nice. But we'd go to dinner parties, and what would they ask? What do your kids do? Right? And my kids were remarkably unremarkable, right? They weren't athletes, they weren't like, and I always felt a little bit ashamed saying, oh, they really like hanging out with their grandparents, right? While everybody else is saying, oh yeah, they're on this elite baseball team, or they're in the young Chicago Symphony Orchestra, whatever it is. And then as we get older, what is it? Where's your child going to school? Where are they going to college? And all of a sudden, it feels like people are looking to see, oh, are they going to an elite college? Feels like a reflection on my child and on me at some level. So I think about this as the happiness conspiracy, that if we have a high income, we're going to be happier. So I want to share a little bit of data about this. A guy named Daniel Kahneman, he's actually a psychologist, but he won the Nobel Prize in economics for this research. What he found is that, and this was in 2010, so it's probably higher now, but people with a salary of 75, it's probably 85, maybe 100,000 now. But once you reach that point, happiness trails off. You can make 100,000, you can make a million, you can make 10 million, and it's about the same. Take a look at what the data says here. So this is what it looks like. So these are the happiness. Experienced some happiness, enjoyment yesterday. That's the red line. Look at it. Goes up, and then it starts to tail off. Did not experience worry or sadness yesterday. Again, significant in the early stages when we don't have a lot of money. But once we have a lot of money, once we have enough, not a lot, once we have enough, our happiness begins to tail off. What they said is $75,000 is a threshold beyond which further increases in income no longer improve adults' ability to do what matters most. So what money does is it gets us to a place where we can do the things that matter most, and what they find is not making more money, not going to our third house in Cabo or whatever, right? It's spending time with people they like, avoiding pain and disease, and enjoying leisure. Once we get those things taken care of, everybody has about the same level of happiness. This is true on a macro scale too. The richest countries in the world. We'd think that the richest countries in the world would be the happiest, wouldn't we? Especially for our kids. So let's take a look. The US, at least, there's lots of different ways you can measure how rich a country is, but this is a pretty good one, right? The United States right here, nominal GDP, okay? Significantly better than anybody else. So let's take a look at adolescent happiness. Oh, let's see. Nope, not in the first 25. Oh, Panama's up there. Slovakia, Bulgaria. US doesn't show up yet. Look at where it is. We're just above Vietnam, right? And just below Honduras. Money doesn't make us happy as a nation or as individuals. So what does? These guys did a study. It was a fascinating study. They took a look at people starting in the late 1930s, and they followed people, about 1,000 people, from the time they were 20-year-olds all the way up, and they're still studying the ones who are alive now. And they've been studying them. The goal of this study was to see, okay, over time, what are the factors that impact people's happiness and health? And what they found was striking, and it was so clear. They said the strongest predictors for people to maintain their happiness and health throughout the course of their lives was having relationships with satisfying levels of quality and warmth. If we want our kids to be happy, if we want them to be healthy, we double down on relationships, not on achievement. The 75 years and $20 million expended on the grant study points to a straightforward 5-word conclusion. Happiness is love, full stop. Or, if we want to listen to Jim Carrey, I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so they can see that this is not the answer. Right? There's a lot of sadness, mental health issues, substance abuse in the people who are wealthiest and seem to have the greatest level of fame. So happiness, the reality is happiness is about the wealth of our relationships, not our money. Here's the next one, and this surprised me as I started doing research on this. Selective schools lead to happiness and success. It's a myth. But I bought into this myth for a long, long time. We see this getting into, and I'm not sure how many of you are students looking at schools now, or parents who are having their kids and taking a look who's going to end up going where, right? So let's take a look and see what the data says about whether or not a selective school does help us get into, help us be happy and have good money. So Fortune 100 CEOs, they looked at the top 100. 7 went to the Ivy League. 8 didn't have a diploma at all. If we take a look at the top CEOs, the 10 top grossing revenues, look at there's only 1 that would show up as an elite school. And if you want some more recent data, I just looked this up. So this is the top 20. You really want to make money, right? Top 25 CEO salaries 2024. Where should you go? Well, we do have about 7 very, very selective schools on there, right? But we also have more than 7 that have acceptance rates of 60 to 80%. MacArthur Genius Grants, they come from Western Michigan, Western Illinois, Illinois Wesleyan, and Southern Illinois. There's a lot of different ways to get here, right? It doesn't have to be through an elite college. And here's the thing, so how did elite colleges start to captivate us in the way that they do? U.S. News & World reports their membership was tanking until they published the first, and it was in the early 1980s, they published the first rankings of schools. And then people started paying attention because we want to have our kids go to the best school. And schools started paying attention to this. And you know what schools started doing? They started saying, okay, what are your metrics? And then we're just going to improve those metrics. And so let's take a look at one of these metrics that's really important. The admissions rate, how selective schools are, is a huge indicator of what they say is a high-performing school. So here's what schools have done. The high-achieving schools did something like they call attracting to reject. The only way to get your selectivity rate down to go from a 10% to a 4% is to have more people apply. So what they did was they started encouraging more juniors and seniors to apply so that they could reject them so that their selectivity rate would go down. These schools define themselves on the people they keep out, not the people they select. And so take a look at what happened. The 50 most competitive schools between 2006 and 2018, the admissions rates dropped by 45%. And in the most elite schools, admission rates dropped from 16% to 3%. So this is how they're hacking this, right? And yet what they're saying is these are the places you should go. UCLA, when I was going to school, was 75%. Look at it now, 9%. We're making it harder and harder on these kids. What happens is we're pushing kids to believe they need to be in a highly selective school, right? Highly selective is better. But then all of a sudden, we're making it significantly harder for them to get in. Can you see how stressful that is? How unhelpful that is for our young people? And then the thing is, we've got to be careful what we wish for. Because when we get it, it's often more of a problem than a help. I like what William, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. So extreme are admission standards now that kids who manage to get into elite colleges have, by definition, never experienced anything but success. The result is a violent aversion to risk. You have no margin for error. So you avoid the possibility that you will ever make an error. And so we've got kids who are now afraid that if I get an A- on something, it's going to blow my future. But here's the thing, they show up at these universities where it's 3% acceptance rate. Guess what? Everybody's in the top 5% of their class, aren't they? There's a psychology professor who said, and he taught freshman psychology, and every first semester he walks in and says, how does it feel to be in the bottom 50%? Half of you are in the bottom 50% for the first time in your life. How does that feel? It feels terrible. So, here's some questions, right? Students learn more in elite colleges. True? Like they've got to at Harvard or Yale, right? Let's take a look at the data. Little evidence suggests that selectivity is related to measures of students' self-reported gains in learning. The weight of evidence simply does not support students' or policymakers' beliefs that a selective admissions process enhances learning. The data doesn't support it. But here's the thing. What does impact learning in college? Any ideas? Time spent studying, believe it or not. Right? You can go to Northern or you can go to Northwestern. And you're going to learn more if you study more, regardless of where you are. This is true regardless of the institution for all kinds of students. There's no evidence that student learning will suffer for attending a less selective college. So what does make a college helpful for kids? This is what they found. Keys to college success: taking a course with a professor who makes learning exciting, working with professors who care about students personally, finding a mentor who encourages you to pursue personal goals, working on a project across several semesters, participating in an internship, being active in extracurricular activities. But you see, these colleges are so focused on having the nicest dorms, having the best food, so they can, having the lowest admissions rates, so they can move the dial on their US News and World Report ranking, that they don't look at these things. Only 14% of graduates felt that they were supported by professors who cared about them. Only 6% of graduates agreed they had a meaningful internship. Only 3% experienced all of those things. So if I was looking, instead of trying to figure out how can I get into the most selective school, and before I start puffing my chest out because Harvard asked my kid to apply, I want to be thinking about what's in their best interest. So then there's a good question. Okay, but what about jobs after college? Right? That's got to be helpful in getting jobs where you can be successful after college. But a Gallup poll found no relationship between college selectivity and both workplace engagement and general well-being. What about the money? You got to make more money if you go to a Harvard, Yale, right? Here's what they found. 10 years after graduation, former students of selective colleges report lower job satisfaction than students from less selective colleges. But students from selective colleges are more likely to feel underpaid. I went to Harvard and I'm making the same thing as someone from Western is making? Are you kidding me? Right? Here's what they did. They took a look, the way they took a look at money was they took a look at kids who had gotten into the highly selective schools but couldn't go for whatever reason, and compared them to the kids who did go. And then they followed them for years and found out that the kids in the selective schools didn't make any more money. So who does benefit? There are people that benefit. Only one group of kids, there's only one group of kids who getting admitted to an Ivy League school was a surefire way to change their life trajectory. And those are the ones who are poorest. Then it can turn the dial for them. For the rest of the kids, again, it isn't the institution that makes the difference, but how engaged they are when they're there. So, job satisfaction, general well-being, learning, and income are all important outcomes of college, but the research shows no relationship between selectivity and learning, job satisfaction, or general well-being. So, the reality is, students who attend selective colleges do not learn more, make more money, or have better careers. All right. Here's the third myth. And this is one that really showed up in my house. Children develop at the same rate. So, I've got a good friend, he coined the term developmental empathy. His name is Dave Gleason. He wrote a great book. Nina, this is your next book, all right? At What Cost? Defending Adolescent Development at Fiercely Competitive Schools. And what he defines developmental empathy as is matching the demands we place on our kids with their brain's development. Right now, the demands we place on them are based on their age, based on their grade. But different kids develop at different rates. This part of our brain, this prefrontal cortex, is still under construction well past 25. They're finding that it's in the early 30s, that this part of our brain that controls some very important things when it comes to our ability to be successful in school, our ability to control our impulse, our emotional regulation, our ability to initiate tasks, especially when it's a non-preferred task, persisting with things that are hard, transitions, empathy, attention, planning, all of these things. If you struggle with these things, life is much harder in a high-achieving school. It's much harder to be successful. And the thing is that when we've got kids who are in the same grade, they may have very different states of their development of the prefrontal cortex, right? We don't all develop at the same rate. When we think about like a middle school class, right? You've got kids walking through our middle schools that are like 6 feet tall and have facial hair and body odor, right? And you've got other kids who are still, they're 3 years away from puberty. And we'd never say, oh, we've got to put the kid without the facial hair on a behavior contract to get them to start growing their facial hair. We wouldn't do that. But this is what we begin doing when kids can't keep up with the ability to plan and to persist through things. If you've got a kid that's in middle school who's 12 years old, they're less than halfway through this development. There's all sorts of time for that to develop. See, development has its own timeline. We each have our own path through development. I had a kid, one of my daughter, she was like born, I think in the womb her prefrontal cortex was fully developed. Like she came out and everything in school was easy for her. For my son, it was much harder. It was harder for him to organize and plan. And that didn't really kick in. He had a lot of struggles in high school. It kicked in when he was in college. A whole different, and then all of a sudden, it became easier for him. See, life is stressful when what we're asked to do, the demands that are placed on us, we don't have the skills to meet them. It's always hard when we can't meet the skills when we can't meet the demands. This incompatibility causes stress. Here's the thing. Schools have never been so demanding, have they? We're asking kids to do in 8th grade now what I had to do in 11th grade. My brain had 3 or 4 more years of development before I was asked to organize a project, to be able to work with other kids in a group project, whatever it may be, do a presentation for the class. And as a result, school's never been so stressful. Here's one of my theories about why life is so stressful for kids, is before 2000, before we all became obsessed with test scores, we had the bell curve of functioning. And there were always going to be some kids who were slower to develop, who struggled, and those kids, about 15% of them really struggled in school because it was hard for them to meet those demands. But here's what we did. When we started saying, okay, academic rigor is a good thing, we forgot that we need kids' brains to develop in order for them to access academic rigor. And so we started pushing this line of expectations farther. And when that happens, when we're asking kids' brains to do more than they're able to do, more and more kids fall in that range of life being stressful. And as a result, we've got more and more kids who are at risk from the stresses of school. And I think that's some of the reason why we saw those graphs at the beginning. See, the thing about development is it requires a lot of failing, doesn't it? Right? Walking. We fall a lot when we walk, right? Some kids fall as many as 69 times per hour. And we never call them clumsy. Oh, that's a clumsy one there, right? No, we wouldn't expect that one to go run my 12-month-old to run a race either. They're not ready developmentally to do that. But when we treat gaps in development as behavior problems, then things get even harder. They're not doing that because they're not motivated to do it. For Matthew, my son Matthew, who I think is on the in the Hall of Fame for a number of detentions at Evanston Township High School, he wanted to do well. His brain wasn't ready to organize, and then he went on and did fine later on, but his brain needed to catch up. When older kids fail, we call them lazy, we call them irresponsible or manipulative, immature, selfish, defiant, whatever it is. See, when we aren't aware of development, we can make really terrible decisions. We punish and shame. And kids already feel shame about these legs. They can't understand why it's easier for, Matthew couldn't understand why it was easier for Anna to do all these things than him. Because we can't see it. When we can see development, it's like, oh, there it is. But when we can't see it, we assume it's motivation. Great book, Malcolm Gladwell wrote this book, Outliers. And in it, he tells a story of a Canadian psychologist who loved his hockey. And so he'd go to these elite youth hockey tournaments. And so he's sitting there, and he'd bring his wife along who didn't like hockey at all. And so she's sitting there, and she's reading the program, and she nudges him, and she said, you know what? Most of these kids were born in January, February, or March. And he says, isn't that interesting? And so he says, so he looks at it, and he's a psychologist. He says, so let's do a study. And what he found is in these elite sports, not just hockey, but swimming and other elite sports, tennis, he found that there's a 40, 30, 20, 10 consistent pattern that the kids who are on these teams, the athletes that are the most in the most elite programs, 40% of them come in the first quarter of the school year, of the year, January through March. And then December, it's 10%, right? December, October, November, December. Any idea why that might be? So what he found was the cutoff for these leagues is January 1st. So if you've got someone who's born January 1st, they're a year older than someone who's born on the 31st. And as a result, if you're in a six-year-old hockey team, you're a year older than everybody else than the other player. You're going to be stronger. You're going to be able to understand plays better. You're going to be able to work better with other people. And all of a sudden you get better coaching because you get onto better leagues, and all of a sudden it begins to snowball from there. Here's the thing. What happens in our schools? What's the cutoff in our schools? The cutoff is September 1st. And what you begin is to find similar patterns. He said teachers aren't any better than coaches at disentangling ability from maturity. So relatively older kids in middle and elementary school, in elementary and middle school, end up getting more encouragement. They're the kids you want to have in class because everything comes easier to them. They tend to get higher grades. They're more likely to be chosen for things like gifted and talented programs because they're a year ahead. Meanwhile, relatively younger kids are more likely to be diagnosed with learning disorders or flagged for problems of behavior. Take a look. ADHD and diagnosis by birthday. They took a look at this, compared August and September birthdays. There's 34% increase in diagnoses of ADHD for kids born in September versus kids born in August. It shows up as behavior, doesn't it? Here's the thing. Development is always on our side. But when we fight development, we lose. When we try and keep pushing kids to achieve when their brains aren't quite ready to do that, to organize things when their brains just need some time to catch up, we can do some real damage. Everyone's developmental path is different, so our work is to try and help them achieve their greatest potential, but starting with where they're at now. Not saying you're in 4th grade, so you should be here. You're a sophomore, so you should be here. Our work is to just prepare them for the next step, not to help them feel ashamed that they're not farther along, and then not wish that they were on a different step. When my son Matthew was struggling, I had a psychologist friend who was kind of a mentor, consultant, and I remember saying, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that Matthew is still struggling with getting his work done this way. And he said, let Matthew know that this will get easier for him. Because that's what development does. Development helps things get easier. For kids, it gets easier to walk. For when you've got executive functioning skills and the prefrontal cortex is slower to develop, it helps me organize in different ways. It's interesting, he was a camp counselor sophomore year. He showed up late every single time for camp. Drove me nuts, right? Why didn't you just leave earlier? He's got all defensive about it. The next year, he'd show up on time, but he spent a lot of time running around without his shoes on, and half the time he showed up without shoes on, right? Senior year, he was counselor of the year. Can you just kind of see his prefrontal cortex developing? Things got easier for him. Not because I was punishing him into going on time, because it became easier for him to track time. Our work is like driving a car at night. I like this. You can only see as far as your headlights. but you can make the whole trip that way. The idea is each of these moments is a moment to help figure out where are they at, what do they need, how can we help them get to the next step, and not think about, oh, we're never going to make it to California this way. So the reality is every child's development has a unique timeline and path, and we can't rush it. All right, this is the last one. Self-esteem is the key to wellness. There's good research on self-esteem, and it came out in the 1990s, and we began to create this self-esteem generation. And I think it was well-meaning. I think it was a good thing, right? And I think we tried to hack it. And when we try and hack self-esteem, I think we've had some terrible, terrible outcomes. So how did we do this? I think as a culture, as parents, as kids, there's this belief that if we are distressed, if we experience distress, then that undermines our self-esteem. So we've got to protect everybody from experiencing distress. Because how does distress go along with self-esteem? And so we began to do this thing called intensive parenting. Mothers and fathers overextend their time, money, curating their child's life in hopes of maximizing their potential. It's interesting. In the last 40 years, we've doubled, as parents, we've actually doubled the amount of time we spend with our kids. And our kids are experiencing mental health problems like never before. Right? Aren't we curious about this? Right? Maybe not, say the teenagers here, right? We began this idea that we can't leave our kids unsupervised. We're going to plan and we're going to do everything that they need. Play dates. I started realizing I never heard of play dates until I was like 40. Right? Like, when did play dates happen? Take a look. Isn't this interesting? This is the number of times the word play date was used. And it just takes off. All of a sudden, kids couldn't just walk outside and start playing with each other. Adults needed to organize it. Adults needed to manage it. Right? Same thing with our sports teams. I remember just riding my bike to the field. My mom and dad never saw me play sports. Thank goodness, because it was not pretty, right? But take a look. I like this. This guy posted this. Little League Baseball has changed over the last 40 years. Right? Think about how involved we are as adults in their sports now. And when they get into conflicts, we mediate those because we're right there. Right? We're doing it all for them. We get them into music programs and we get them enrichment activities. And if they don't have something in the afternoon, then we got to add something because we can get them tutoring. We got to help them develop as much as we can. We continue to add. And with this myth that more is better, the more teams they're on, the more enrichment activities they have. Here's the thing. Have we ever said, you've only had 2 ice cream sundaes, how about a third? Right? We would never do that because there is a point at when too much is too much. There can be too much of a good thing. And so our intensive parenting, we can have unintended consequences. Not only are we protecting our kids from experiences that are essential for them in their development, but guess who else is overwhelmed by it all? As parents, it's like, okay, what's this afternoon look like? Is it ballet shoes or is it shin pads? Right? And we got to get it. Who's got the snack? Everybody's moving around everywhere. And we deprive kids of some really important things, don't we? The ability to tolerate discomfort, because we're there to take away that discomfort and solve the problem for them. The ability to develop a sense of personal competence. When we solve problems for them, then they don't have the belief and understanding that they can solve it themselves. And the belief that they can solve their own problems. These are the keys to resilience. If we want our kids to be resilient, then when they experience distress, they have the skills to address that. When they experience a conflict with someone, they learn how to do it because they are actively engaged in that themselves. By overemphasizing self-esteem, we can make them feel okay when they should be more worried. It's okay for kids to be worried about things. How else do we expect them to know how to manage worry as they get older if we try and take away their worry? We increase their sense of entitlement. I shouldn't have to work this hard. This is uncomfortable for me. The benefits of not supervising your child is they get bored. Ideally, if they don't have their phone, maybe without the phone, they won't get bored. But they'll be in more conflict. They'll make more mistakes. They'll have more bruises. And these are the building blocks, developmental building blocks to being successful. Rafts of research prove that intensive parenting mainly serves to burn out parents while harming children's competence and mental health. This is why the Surgeon General issued that warning, is it's exhausting for us. And we don't read the research. In 2018, 75% of people said intensive parenting scenarios were very good or excellent. Less than 40% said the same about showing a non-intensive approach. And our anxiety is contagious. Anxious parents, in seeking to insulate their children from risk and danger, are unintentionally transferring their anxiety to them. We've got to be careful. When our kid gets anxious, then we get anxious. We want to fix it. We don't want our kids to experience that. And then they see our anxiety, and they realize even more that this distress is not okay. My parents are anxious about this. Parents, whether they mean to or not, seem to be making the problem worse. Young people's increasing fear of not being perfect was driven in part by what they thought their parents wanted from them. And perfectionism has doubled in the last few decades. And the thing about perfectionism is you do really well to get through high school, but they don't perform any better when they get into the world of work. What they do is they perfect the art of following, they perfect the art of compliance. But achieving excellence in school often requires mastering old ways of thinking. Building an influential career demands new ways of thinking. It's not tell me what to do and I'll do it just right. It's here's a problem, I will figure this out. Two very different skills. And if you're struggling, it doesn't mean that bad things are going to happen. I like this post. I got a 2.4 GPA my first semester in college. Thought maybe I wasn't cut out for engineering. Today I've landed 2 spacecraft on Mars, and I'm now designing one for the moon. STEM is hard for everyone. Grades ultimately aren't what matter. Curiosity and perseverance are. But what we've done for so many kids is created achievement addiction. They call this the hedonic treadmill, which is an interesting metaphor. It's this constant pursuit of achievement. And the reason why it's a treadmill is because it's exhausting, but you never get to the end because there's always something more to achieve. I got a 5 on my AP class. All right, now I got to make it to Harvard or Yale. I got into Yale. Now I've got to make it be in the top 10% there. Oh, I did that. Now I've got to have the best, get into the best law school. Did that. Now I've got to get the best clerkship. When does it end? If we define ourselves based on what we've achieved, it doesn't end. The human tendency, what happens is we feel great when we get that 5 on the AP class or we get into Harvard. But what happens is we get this, it's temporary, and then it comes back down to normal. We buy a new car and it smells great, but then the new car smell goes away and it's like, oh yeah, it's not so great getting into this car anymore. The same thing happens. And then they return to baseline, right? So what happens is we start with a desire, we get it, but then we adapt to it. We adapt to the more money that we got in that raise. We adapt to the new job we got. We adapt to the promotion. We adapt to whatever it may be. And then we get unhappy because then there's something else to achieve, and we just do it again. We chase achievement but get nowhere because there's always more to achieve. And the problem is you continue to achieve, but then you just feel continually empty and wanting. And that's why you find so many people who seem to be at the peak of their careers who are struggling with alcoholism, who are struggling with divorces, who are struggling in all sorts of ways with their mental health. I like this. My daughter told me this. She says, "It's the hedonic treadmill is like winning a pie eating contest, and the prize is more pie. Right? You got into Harvard, now you got to study even harder. Right? You got into top 10%, now you've got to get into the next thing. We just get more and more of it. And the problem, and I'm not sure, I think that I didn't want to be someone who was like this, and then I realized I was. Right? That as I really took a look, my son's struggles and my daughter's successes in school, I felt like were a reflection on me. Here's the thing. When we emphasize self-esteem, we deprive our kids of their most important developmental task, which is building resilience. And resilience comes from stress. You can't develop resilience without experiencing stress. There's an interesting metaphor for this, the biosphere too. They created this perfect environment in which they created the perfect conditions to grow plants in this biosphere too. And they had these palm trees that would grow up and they grew fast. But then they started to fall over. You know why? There's no wind. And what does wind do? Wind helps, when they started getting pushed, they would develop broader root systems. And when there's wind, it strengthens the wood that make up the trunk. But without that, they would fall apart. The same thing is true for our kids. What we want to do when our kids are struggling is not just to let them out there on their own, but I like what Lisa DeMore says. She says, is the stress uncomfortable or unmanageable? If they're uncomfortable, that's okay. It makes sense that we're uncomfortable because then we can deal with it. There are some stresses that are unmanageable and that we do need to intervene. But it's important that we know which those are, and it's important for kids to know, okay, this is manageable, it's really hard, I wish it wasn't happening, but I got this, versus I need help with this. I like this story of resilience. Whenever I get discouraged and want to quit something, I remember the words of my then 3-year-old after she puked carrots all over the living room floor. I'm going to need more carrots. Isn't that great? Right? That's our work, right? Here's the interesting thing, I think, and this is why I think in middle school and high school it's particularly hard, is kids have relied on us to take care of everything. But then when they hit 12, 13, 14, there's this pull to separate from us. And yet we haven't given them the skills they need in order to manage that world independently. Alison Gopnik talks about 2 different kinds of parenting. Intensive parents are carpenters, hammering children into a particular shape, one stroke at a time. Gardening parents pour their labor into creating preconditions of love, safety, and stability for their kids to grow in unpredictable ways. I've been both. And sometimes it's hard for me to let go of the hammer when I want things to go the way I think they should go. Right? I want it to be on the left side, what people think it looks like. I think, okay, if you just listen to me, it's going to be okay. But success is much messier. And it's essential that it's messy. And as adults, can we communicate? Can we model this stepping into the messiness? Can we talk about our anxieties, our failures, our struggles, our weaknesses, our insecurities? I remember sitting down to dinner a couple of times and thinking, I want my kids to talk about all the things that are hard for them. When did I ever talk about the things that were hard for me? I didn't. I realized I am letting them down. See, children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them. Adam Grant says, children pay attention to our attention. Where we focus tells them what to prize. What messages are we sending? You know, it's interesting. Perceived parental criticism and unreachable standards predicts childhood depression. And we think as adults, oh, I'm not sending that message. Here's what the data says. 90% of parents report that their top priority for their child is that they're caring. 81% of children report that their parents value achievement over caring. They're getting a different message. Here's some ways that we can take a look at this. We say, all I care is that you try your best, but then I wince when they get a low grade, right? Grades are not important to me. But then I put the straight A report card up on the fridge and tell friends, he's doing so well in school, we're so proud, right? These are the messages they're getting. You can go to any college you want. I just want you to be happy. Why are you looking at Northern? You could totally get into Northwestern, right? There we are. And we got to notice how it shows up. How often do your comments and conversations have to do with achievement? And I think you'd be surprised if you really take a look in an inventory how often that happens, because we get anxious, because we believe in all these things. At some level, society bakes it into us. So what's the alternative? Can we cultivate this idea of self-compassion, a process of being kind to yourself? It's remembering that failing is a part of the human condition. We're all imperfect. So can we, when they struggle, can we be warm and supportive to ourselves in the midst of our failure? For students, can they experience that? Can we help them be warm and not beat themselves up too much? What does it look like as parents? Can we just be present and avoid the impulse to fix it? I like this quote, don't just do something, stand there. Right? Can we just be present with them and say, yeah, this is really hard. I'll bet you're going to figure this out, but I'll bet it'll be hard. If you want some help thinking through it, I can help you with that. But I'm not going to get on the phone with their teacher or with with their friend's parent to solve it for them. The idea is, can we just be present? Because the thing about feelings is they're real, but they're always fleeting. I have never been really down and not eventually felt on top of the world again. And I've never been really happy when at some point I feel down or anxious again. This is just how emotions go, don't they? It's like, I think about it as surfing, right? These waves are coming. It's not can I be on the top of every wave? It's impossible. But can I ride the waves well? When I'm feeling down, do I have the skills to be able to persist and do what I need to do? And then, as things get better, can I believe and understand, oh, they're good now, but I'll bet they're going to be hard again. For so long, I would feel somehow that life betrayed me if all of a sudden I was happy and then I'm sad or anxious again. No, that's just how life works. Our work in being resilient is being able to ride these waves, not control the waves. You know, our parenting involves moving dials, right? So what are the dials we want to move? We want our kids to know that we love them, regardless of what they do or regardless of what their grades are, regardless. We want to validate their feelings. You know, oh, that's ridiculous. No, you're going to do fine. Why would you feel that? You're so popular. Why would you worry about that? You're so smart. No, you're worried about that. I get it, right? Don't just do something, stand there. And then can we have consistent quality time? Can we show up and be consistently, but not interfere and run their lives? That's different than quality time, which is just time being present. But it also means turning some dials down, doing their homework for them, rescuing them from their distress, feeling responsible for their boredom, solving their problems for them, becoming over-involved in their social lives. These are the things that we want to dial down. And then what do we adjust? Enrichment activities, do we got too many? Maybe as a family, what we say is you can only be on one team a season. Each of you can only be on one team a season so we can have a reasonable life, right? Is that what's best for all of you? So do we need to, or maybe tutoring is getting in the way of our ability to have dinner together. I'm not sure if tutoring's worth not ever having dinner together, right? Tutoring programs, recreational activities, supporting their hard times. There are times that we want to get involved to help and support them that they need us, and other times that we get over-involved. And it's about noticing, and it's about checking in with them. What kind of help do you need right now from me? I like the idea of family dinners. And I think that one of the things that in this stressful world that we've created because of our teams and our extracurricular activities and all of the things that we're doing, I think that family dinners are an endangered species now in a lot of families. And the research on family dinners is good, and there are some families who just can't do it because of life circumstances. So I guess I would say that this is time together as a family, structured, organized, consistent time together as a family, and hopefully we can find that, because when we can all be together as families, there's some great results that just start to show up. Kids' vocabulary and achievement in reading go up. Their empathy and social skills go up because they're watching us and they're learning from us as parents. They're engaging and practicing among themselves. Talk about practicing how to manage conflict. Siblings are great at learning how to do that with one another, right? And suicide, substance abuse, depression, aggression, teenage sex all goes down when we invest in having time together so that we can learn from one another. We can be present for one another. And it's not about the broccoli, right? It's about this time that we have dedicated to being present, dedicated to, for me, modeling how to manage challenges. So the reality is children actually benefit from tolerable stress. And that's the thing, is we want to make it tolerable, right? So the myths: money makes us happy. Elite colleges are the key to success. Children develop at the same rate, and self-esteem is essential for wellness. The reality is that relationships make us happy. Can we double down on that? Engagement is the key to success. Everybody's development is unique, and resilience is what's essential for wellness. Imagine how the world would be different if we realized we didn't have to build our child's resume, or if every student wasn't trying to build their own resume to get into that selective school. If we weren't anxious about, so anxious they will not keep up, what would we do differently? You know, it's interesting. There was a little study that kind of went this way, that was a natural study. It was a hard study because it happened in the spring of 2020. COVID hit, and a lot of things changed during COVID. And what they found, so this, especially in high-achieving schools, so Sonia Luther found this. She's been studying high-achieving schools forever, and she noticed something happened in 2019. The well-being of students in high-achieving schools actually improved during COVID. As classes and exams were canceled, grading moved to pass-fail, and extracurricular activities ceased, they reported lower levels of stress, anxiety, and depression compared with the year before. Now, we all know, I'm not saying they were happy. They weren't happy that their team was, their sports season was canceled. They weren't happy that they couldn't be in the play. They weren't happy. So happy is different than well, right? What they found is they were less anxious. That homework wasn't the first thing people asked about when they got home. And then the battles between parent and child went away when there wasn't homework. I worked in my private practice, and kids would be like, I hate COVID. I hate remote learning, but I love the fact that I don't have to do homework, and we don't have to argue about homework every night. Now we figure out what show are we going to watch, or who's going to walk the dog together. That became the conversation. Kids started getting more sleep. It's interesting. One of the things that has happened since 1980 to 2010 is kids are getting it, and this is before cell phones, or this is before smartphones, rather. Kids are getting an hour less sleep in 2010 than 1980. Is that a big deal? It sure is, because 1 hour of sleep has a huge impact on ADHD, obesity, behavior problems, academic problems, and social skills problems. It just happens, right? When we get more sleep, we are so much better. Schedules. We were no longer overscheduling kids, and we were no longer overscheduled ourselves. You know, I thought about this time, and I thought, all right, what if, I'm thinking about about what it's like for a junior in high school, in a high-achieving school, trying to get into a highly selective college. And I realized, what would I need to do? I'd like, if I was an adult, it would be like me telling my wife, hey, listen, here's my schedule. I'm going to wake up at 5 in the morning, and I'm going to play basketball with my buddies every morning from 5:30 to 7, and then I'm going to go straight to work. I'm going to work through lunch so I can get done with work in time to do to be a part of a garage band, right? And we're going to do some songs and gigs on the weekend. And I'm probably going to get home about 7 or 8 o'clock at night. I'll just warm up some food. I'll go into my office, and I'll finish up my email then until about midnight, and I'm going to do it all over again. What would my wife say? Well, there'll be some divorce papers waiting for you there, because that is not a life I want to live with you, and that's not a healthy life for you. And yet, in so many ways, this is the life that we put on a pedestal for a lot of our kids. So here's the thing that happened. When the fall of 2020 came, we blew it. We went right back. We had this data, and we went right back. These improvements were short-lived. The improvements in wellness were short-lived. Beginning in the fall of 2020, as compared to as schoolwork ramped back up, the mental health of adolescents returned to pre-pandemic levels or worse. See, here's the thing. COVID shined a light on our children and our community. We learned something there. We would never want to go back, but are there lessons we can take with us? David Foster Wallace gave the commencement address 2005 at Kenyon College, and he told this story. He says, there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way who nods at them and says, morning, boys, how's the water? And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell's water?" So here's the story. Here's what he says. The immediate point of the fish story is that the most obvious, ubiquitous, and important realities are often the ones that are hardest for us to see and talk about. And I think one of the hardest things, we've been admiring this mental health crisis for a long time. I think the hard thing to talk about is how we are part of this society. We are all swimming in this water. We are all drinking from this pond that says that high achievement is the way to get to where we need to go. And as a result, we are harming our kids and we're harming ourselves. We had an opportunity to be out of the water. But now that we know, what will we do? I think that's our challenge. All right, thank you very much. And I think I've got time for questions.